39 people, all found in the same house, all wearing identical black clothing, all with the same Nike shoes on their feet, all dead. No signs of a struggle, no forced entry, no screaming neighbors who heard anything go wrong. Just 39 human beings who had, by every appearance, simply decided it was time to go. What could possibly convince nearly 40 people to willingly end their lives together, smiling, calm, and utterly convinced they were about to board a spaceship? That's not a hypothetical question. It happened. In March of 1997, in a mansion in sunny Rancho Santa Fe, California, the world woke up to one of the most chilling and baffling mass deaths in modern history. And at the center of it all was one man, a preacher's son from a small Texas town who had spent his entire life searching for a stage worthy of his talent. His name was Marshall Applewhite, Jr., and this is his story. To understand how Heaven's Gate ended, you have to understand how Marshall began, because he didn't start out as a cult leader. He started out as something far more ordinary and in many ways far more relatable. On May 17, 1931, Marshall Huff Applewhite, Jr. was born in Spur, Texas, a tiny, dusty town where everyone knew everyone, and faith wasn't just a Sunday activity, it was the entire foundation of life. Marshall was the youngest of 4 children, and his father, Marshall Sr., was a Presbyterian minister who traveled constantly to establish churches across the state of Texas. The whole family moved with him. This constant uprooting shaped Marshall in ways that would echo throughout his entire life. He never stayed in one place long enough to put down deep roots. He learned early how to walk into a room full of strangers and make them feel like he'd known them forever. He learned how to adapt, how to perform, how to make people like him. And people did like him, immediately and intensely. Even as a young boy, Marshall had what you might call an undeniable presence. He threw himself into church choir and theater with a passion that went far beyond simple participation. His voice, a warm and resonant baritone, drew gasps from congregation members who couldn't believe such a sound was coming from someone so young. His teachers noticed his sharp mind. His classmates were drawn to his natural charisma. By the time he graduated from Corpus Christi High School in 1948, he had served as president of the National Honor Society and was widely regarded as one of the most promising young men anyone around him had ever met. Here was a kid who seemed, genuinely, like he had it all figured out. But beneath that polished, confident exterior, something quieter was stirring. Questions about identity, questions about faith, questions about who he really was versus who everyone expected him to be. For now, those questions stayed buried. Marshall was too busy living the life that had been laid out for him. After high school, he enrolled at Austin College in Sherman, Texas, majoring in philosophy. It was a natural fit for someone who had grown up asking big questions, even if most of those questions were still unspoken. A professor named Glenn Maxwell introduced Marshall and his classmates to the great thinkers, Aristotle, Plato, John Locke, and pushed them to challenge assumptions rather than simply accept what they were told. One of Marshall's college roommates, John Alexander, later remembered him clearly. He was an extrovert, Alexander said. He was popular and he was very smart. Marshall was involved in everything: choirs, student councils, campus organizations. He graduated in 1952 with a Bachelor of Arts degree, married a woman named Ann Pierce, and enrolled in Union Presbyterian Theological Seminary, seemingly set to follow in his father's footsteps as a minister. It looked like the story was writing itself. But Marshall Applewhite was never quite what it looked like. And soon, the carefully constructed life he had built would begin to crack. Slowly at first, then all at once. There's a pattern that shows up again and again in the lives of cult leaders, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. It's not that they're monsters from the beginning, it's that they're almost always talented people, genuinely talented, who keep running headfirst into walls. Failed dreams, broken relationships, missed opportunities. And somewhere in the wreckage of all those failures, the ego doesn't collapse. It transforms. It finds a new story, a bigger one where all the pain suddenly means something. Marshall Applewhite was living proof of that pattern. After serving 2 years in the U.S. Army, stationed in Austria and New Mexico as part of the Signal Corps, he came home with an honorable discharge and a renewed hunger for music. He enrolled at the University of Colorado in Boulder to pursue graduate studies in musical theater performance, diving deeper into opera and performance work. He had a genuine gift. People who heard him sing remembered it. He earned his master's degree, and by his early 30s, he looked from the outside like a man in full command of his life. He was formally educated, he was performing, he was teaching, he was a husband and a father. He was respected and admired. But inside, something was deeply, persistently wrong. In the early 1960s, Marshall made the move that so many talented performers make, the leap toward the big stage. He went to New York, chasing Broadway and the opera circuit, determined to prove that his voice and his talent belonged in front of the largest audiences possible. It didn't happen. He worked, he hustled, he took odd jobs to support his family, singing in community productions, doing commercial work, even working as an occupational therapist at a tuberculosis sanitarium at one point. But the breakthrough he was chasing stayed just out of reach. Minor roles, near misses, a career that never quite ignited the way he believed it should. For most people, this kind of disappointment is painful but survivable. You adjust your expectations, you find another path. But for Marshall, who had grown up being told he was exceptional, who had built his entire sense of self around the idea that he was destined for something great, each failure landed like a verdict. Eventually, he stepped back from the performance world and took a more stable route, becoming an assistant professor of music at the University of Alabama, serving as a choir master. Steady work, respected position, a reasonable life. And then came the scandal that changed everything. In 1964 or 1965, sources differ slightly on the exact year, Marshall was forced to resign from his position at the University of Alabama after it was discovered that he had started a sexual relationship with a male student. Let's be clear about what made this a genuine red flag. The problem wasn't his sexuality. The problem was that he was a married man, he was in a position of authority, and the relationship was with a student, someone he had power over. Whatever the full circumstances, the outcome was the same. His career at the university was over. But the fallout didn't stop there. His wife, Anne, discovered the affair. After a period of separation, she filed for divorce in 1968. The split was civil. Marshall apparently did genuinely love his family, but it gutted him. He had built a life around an image of himself that he simply couldn't sustain. The marriage, the children, the respectable career, all of it was crumbling. And then he did something that takes real courage, or perhaps desperation. He came out to his parents, hoping that if he could just be honest, they might understand. His father did not understand. Marshall Sr., the devout Presbyterian minister who had spent his life preaching acceptance and grace, responded to his son's confession with rejection. He essentially shut Marshall out of his life for bringing what he considered shame on the family. Think about what that moment must have felt like. Marshall had already lost his job, he had already lost his marriage and his daily life with his children, and now, reaching out for the one connection that might anchor him, he lost his father too. He picked himself back up, the way he always did. He moved back to Texas, secured a position as chairman of the music department at St. Thomas in Houston, started directing an Episcopal choir, and even began performing secondary roles with the Houston Grand Opera. Students found him stylish, warm, and inspiring. Stability had returned, at least on the surface. But something had shifted permanently inside Marshall Applewhite. He began to grow increasingly erratic. Colleagues noticed. By March of 1970, he abruptly resigned from St. Thomas, citing emotional turmoil and depression. Some researchers believe a second inappropriate relationship with a student may have forced him out, though this was never confirmed. Either way, he was gone. No job, no family, no father. His career in music
The dream he had carried his entire life was effectively over. And it was in this lowest, most hollowed-out version of himself that Marshall Applewhite was about to meet someone who would tell him exactly what he had been desperate to hear, that he wasn't a failure, he was chosen.
Rock bottom has a way of making people open to things they would have laughed at before. When you still have a career, a family, a reputation, when life is working, you can afford to be skeptical. You can roll your eyes at the person on the street corner telling you the end is near. You can scroll past the strange pamphlet left on the coffee shop table. You have something to protect, so you protect it by staying reasonable. But when everything is gone, when every path you tried has collapsed beneath your feet, when the people who were supposed to love you unconditionally have turned their backs, suddenly, someone telling you that you have a divine purpose doesn't sound crazy. It sounds like the only thing left. By 1971, Marshall Applewhite had abandoned Houston entirely. He drifted to New Mexico and tried something completely different, opening a small deli, attempting to reinvent himself as a simple businessman. And for a moment, it almost worked. He still had that natural magnetism, that ability to connect with people, and customers were drawn to him. But his mental state was deteriorating. The depression that had been building for years was becoming impossible to manage. He closed the deli, returned to Texas empty-handed, and found himself buried in debt, borrowing money from old friends with nowhere to turn and no clear reason to keep trying. He was a preacher's son who had wanted to be a star. He had tried Broadway and failed. He had built a respectable academic career and destroyed it. His marriage was gone. His children were growing up without him. His father had died, without the two of them ever truly reconciling, compounding the grief and unresolved guilt that had already been eating him alive. And then, in the spring of 1972, Marshall was hospitalized in Houston. The exact reason remains disputed. Some accounts say it was related to a heart condition. Others suggest it was a psychiatric crisis. Possibly both. But whatever landed him in that hospital bed, what happened inside that room would prove to be the turning point that set the next 25 years in motion. His sister Louise later said that while Marshall was hospitalized, a nurse came to his bedside and told him something extraordinary. She said he had survived for a reason, that God had kept him alive, that he had a purpose he had not yet fulfilled. That nurse's name was Bonnie Lou Trussdale Nettles. She was 44 years old, married but in an increasingly unhappy marriage, and she had spent years developing a deep interest in astrology, mysticism, and biblical prophecy. She even wrote an astrology column for a local newspaper. She was, by every conventional measure, an unlikely person to change the course of history. But the moment she and Marshall began talking, something clicked into place for both of them that neither could fully explain. Marshall later said he felt like he had known Bonnie his entire life, that the connection was so immediate and so deep that it felt like they had met in a past existence. Bonnie, for her part, told him that she had already received a message about him from extraterrestrial beings who had been communicating with her, and that his arrival in her life had been foretold. For someone else, in a different state of mind, this might have triggered alarm bells, but Marshall wasn't someone else, and this wasn't a different moment. This was a broken man who had been searching his entire life for a story that made his suffering mean something, and Bonnie was handing him one. He believed her completely. What made their relationship so unusual and so important to everything that came later was what it wasn't. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't sexual. For Marshall, who had spent years tormented by the tension between his religious upbringing and his sexuality, who had once confided to a lover that he longed for what he called a sexless devotion, a deep, passionate connection untangled from physical desire, Bonnie was the answer to a prayer he hadn't known how to voice. Bonnie's daughter, Terry, would later describe the relationship simply. It wasn't like a romantic thing, more like a friendship, a platonic thing. But the bond between them was intense and total.
They talked for hours about theology, mysticism, extraterrestrial life, the nature of the universe, and the role they might be meant to play in it. Marshall read a story Bonnie had written years earlier about a man who dies and ascends to heaven, and became convinced it had been written about him. They both felt that this meeting was not a coincidence, it was a cosmic appointment. Within weeks, Marshall and Bonnie had formed an unbreakable partnership built on a shared conviction they had been sent to Earth together. They understood something about the universe that no one else did, and it was their mission, their sacred obligation, to share it. The only question now was how.
Picture two middle-aged people. No money, no stable home, no institution backing them up, and no credentials beyond their own conviction. One is a former music professor with a broken career. The other is a nurse with a passion for astrology and a rocky marriage. Together, they climb into an old car and hit the road across the American West, absolutely certain that they had been chosen by God, or something beyond God, to deliver a message that will change everything. On paper, it sounds absurd. But here's the thing about conviction. When it's genuine, people feel it. And whatever else Marshall Applewhite was, he was absolutely, unshakably convinced of everything he said. That kind of certainty is magnetic, in a way that logic alone rarely is. In February 1973, Marshall and Bonnie made the decision to leave behind what little stability they still had. Bonnie's husband, watching his wife grow increasingly consumed by her relationship with Marshall and their shared spiritual obsessions, had begun divorce proceedings. She ultimately lost custody of her children as a result. Marshall, for his part, cut ties permanently with his ex-wife, his kids, and his remaining siblings. They chose each other, and they chose the mission. They pawned most of their belongings, kept only what they absolutely needed, and set off. Money was so tight that there were stretches where simple dinner rolls were their only food. When cash ran completely dry, they sold their own blood. They camped wherever they could, and when they did stay in motels, they sometimes slipped out in the morning without paying. But none of this felt like poverty to them. It felt like purpose. On the road, they built their theology the way a sculptor works, piece by piece, shaping and refining as they went. They pulled from a remarkably wide range of sources, reading theosophy, psychology, science fiction, and New Age philosophy, alongside deep dives into the biblical New Testament, particularly the Book of Revelation and its language about the second coming, resurrection, and the end of the world. They were especially fascinated by a passage in Revelation 11 describing two prophets who were killed, then resurrected 3.5 days later, ascending into the sky as the world watches. Marshall and Bonnie looked at that passage and saw themselves. They also drew from science fiction writers like Robert Heinlein and Arthur C. Clarke, whose stories explored the idea of humanity transcending its physical limitations and moving to higher planes of existence. They took the biblical language of salvation and eternity and reframed it in the vocabulary of space travel and evolutionary advancement. The result was something genuinely unlike anything that had come before it, a belief system that treated the kingdom of heaven not as a metaphor, but as a literal physical location in outer space, a place where beings existed at a higher level of consciousness, what they called the next level, and where humans could ascend if they were willing to shed their earthly attachments. The vehicle for this ascension wouldn't be prayer or grace, it would be a spaceship. They began referring to themselves as the Two, a reference to the two prophets from Revelation, and started circulating handwritten pamphlets claiming that Jesus had returned, this time as a Texan, which, given that Marshall was from Texas, was not a subtle claim. They also predicted that they would both be martyred and resurrected 3.5 days later, just as written in Revelation, at which point a spacecraft would arrive to transport them and their followers off the planet. This event, they said, would be the proof, the demonstration, the moment the world would finally understand who they were. They converted their first follower about a year into the journey, then a second, then a few more. In August of 1974, Marshall was arrested, not for anything related to his theology, but for failing to return a rental car he had driven from Missouri to Texas. He had, by all accounts, convinced himself he was divinely authorized to keep it. The courts were not persuaded by this argument. He spent approximately 6 months in jail.
Bonnie kept things moving while he was gone, and when Marshall rejoined her in 1975, he came back sharper, more focused, and more certain than ever. They gave each other nicknames, Bo and Peep, a reference to the idea of shepherds guiding their flock. They set up a small teaching center in Houston. They opened a bookstore carrying spiritual texts from across traditions. They were preparing, methodically, to take their message to the world. And in the fall of 1975, they got their first real chance. The town was Waldport, Oregon. The date was September 14th. They put up posters around town, rented a meeting room at a local motel, and waited to see who would show up. Nearly 200 people walked through the door, and when the night was over, 20 of them would walk out and never go back to their old lives again.
Waldport, Oregon, is a small coastal town. The kind of place where not much happens, where people know their neighbors, and where the unexpected stands out immediately. So when strange posters started appearing around town in September of 1975, posters asking whether anyone was interested in reaching the next evolutionary level beyond human, and promising to reveal secrets known only to two mysterious visitors, people noticed. Some laughed, some ignored it entirely. But around 200 people were curious enough to show up at the Bayshore Inn Motel on the evening of September 14th to hear what these two mysterious visitors actually had to say. What they saw was not what they expected. Marshall and Bonnie did not look like prophets. They didn't dress dramatically or perform rituals or speak in tongues. They were calm, soft-spoken, and utterly ordinary in appearance. Two middle-aged people who looked more like your neighbors than like the leaders of a UFO movement. One witness described them as very unassuming. And that, paradoxically, was part of what made them compelling. Standing in front of that crowd, Marshall explained their message the same way he always had, directly, earnestly, and with total conviction. He and Bonnie were not human, he said. They were extraterrestrial beings who had taken human form in order to guide humanity through what was coming. The Earth was approaching a moment of massive upheaval, a recycling, he called it, after which the planet would essentially be reset for a future civilization. The only escape was to leave with them, not metaphorically, literally, on a spacecraft that would carry the worthy to the next level. Those who wanted to join would need to leave their lives immediately. Their families, their jobs, their possessions, all of it had to go. Earthly attachments, Marshall explained, were the very thing standing between humanity and ascension. When he and Bonnie left Waldport that night, 20 people went with them. 20 people who just hours earlier had been living ordinary lives, with families, with jobs, with rent to pay and groceries to buy, simply walked away. They left their homes and their relationships and followed two strangers into the unknown. The town was stunned. People just disappeared, one remaining resident said. One man chased after the group in his car, desperately trying to convince his wife to come back. She didn't. Law enforcement looked into the situation and found nothing they could act on. Everyone had left voluntarily, no laws had been broken. And just like that, America was introduced to what the media quickly dubbed the UFO cult. Word spread fast. Reporters chased the story. By late 1975, estimates put the group's membership somewhere around 100 people, scattered across the western United States, with some counts suggesting the number reached as high as 200 at its peak. A book was published in 1976 chronicling their rise. The national press was fascinated and baffled in equal measure. The attention made Marshall and Bonnie deeply uncomfortable. Too many eyes meant too many questions, and too many opportunities for someone to publicly call out their claims as nonsense. So they made a deliberate decision, step back from large-scale recruitment, downsize the group, and focus on quality over quality. Members who weren't fully committed, who created friction, who expressed doubts, who couldn't keep up with the demands, were quietly encouraged to leave, sometimes even given a small amount of money to help them go. Those who remained were the truest believers, the ones who had surrendered everything and had nothing left to return to if they wanted to.
Life inside the group, which Marshall called the class and whose members he called the crew, was unlike anything in mainstream society. They camped in remote locations to stay off the radar. All money and possessions were surrendered to a communal pool. Contact with anyone outside the group was forbidden. Members were paired up at all times, not out of companionship, but as a system of mutual accountability, each watching the other for any sign of wavering loyalty. They gave up their birth names. They gave up their individual clothing styles. They were assigned identical outfits, plain shirts, sweatpants, and given the same haircut regardless of gender. The intent was explicit: erase the individual, reinforce the collective. Romance was banned, sex was banned, fried foods were banned. Members followed detailed, scheduled daily routines down to the minute. Everything, what they ate, when they slept, how they spent every hour of the day, was controlled. And yet, many members reported feeling a profound sense of peace. Because for people who had spent their whole lives searching for something that felt true and real and bigger than themselves, for people exhausted by a world that felt chaotic and meaningless, the strict structure wasn't oppressive. It felt like clarity, like finally being somewhere that made sense. Marshall led with a combination of warmth and authority that former members would spend years trying to fully describe. He was soft-spoken, almost gentle when he was pleased. He seemed to genuinely care about the people around him. But disobedience was met with swift and serious correction, and the most powerful threat of all was never spoken aloud. It was simply understood. If you left, you forfeited your place on the spaceship. If you left, you chose destruction over salvation. How free were they really? In Part 6, the group retreats from the public eye, and behind closed doors, Marshall's control grows more extreme than anyone on the outside could imagine.
There is a particular kind of danger that lives in isolation. Not the dramatic danger of a locked room or a barred window, but the quieter, more insidious danger of a world that slowly shrinks until the only reality that exists is the one being handed to you. When everyone around you believes the same things, speaks the same language, follows the same rules, and looks to the same authority, after long enough, those beliefs stop feeling like a choice. They simply feel like the truth. This was the world Marshall Applewhite built, deliberately, methodically, over many years. And by the early 1980s, he had perfected it. As the group settled into a more stationary existence, Marshall used an influx of money, possibly from inheritance or member donations, to move them into rented houses, first in Denver, then Texas, and eventually a large mansion in California. From the outside, these homes looked like perfectly normal communal living arrangements. Windows were sometimes covered, neighbors might occasionally notice the unusual number of people coming and going, but nothing ever looked alarming enough to investigate. Inside was a different world entirely. Every minute of every day was accounted for. Members followed precise schedules for waking, eating, working, and sleeping. They were paired with a partner at all times, someone who was responsible for monitoring them and reporting any concerning behavior to leadership. No one was ever alone. Privacy, in any meaningful sense, did not exist. The doctrine around this was clear. The ego was the enemy. Personal desires, individual preferences, private thoughts, these were not just distractions, they were obstacles to spiritual advancement. Marshall's job, as he saw it, was to systematically dismantle the individual self so that something purer could take its place. He called it overcoming the human level. The group experimented with various dietary regimes in the name of bodily purification: raw food, wheatgrass, juice-only periods. They eventually settled into a strict and deeply boring routine: grain cereal in the morning, a low-fat sandwich for lunch, a protein and vegetable dinner at night. No fried food, no indulgences of any kind. Members wore identical baggy clothing, plain shirts and sweatpants, and were given matching haircuts designed to obscure gender differences. They adopted new names that all followed the same format: 3 consonants in the first syllable, ending in the suffix -ody. Names like Jimodi, Lavodi, Dianodi.
Names that sounded like nothing in any human language, because that was the point. These weren't people anymore, in the way the world understood the word. They were members of the next level, temporarily housed in human bodies. One-on-one friendships were forbidden. If two members seemed to be growing particularly close, forming any attachment that existed outside the group dynamic, they were immediately separated and assigned to different tasks and partners. The fear was that personal bonds created loyalties that competed with loyalty to Doe and T. An investigator who later examined the mansion noted that there was essentially nothing in the house that reflected any individual personality. No personal books, no private photos, no individual collections of any kind. Only 100 or so homemade videotapes of group teachings and the final farewell messages members would record in their last days. And then there was the matter of the castrations. In his relentless drive to eliminate sexual distraction from the group, driven, many later suggested, by his own profound and unresolved anguish around sexuality, Marshall began encouraging male members who still struggled with their libido to consider surgical castration. Not as a punishment, as a gift, he framed it, a liberation from the most stubborn of human desires. Several male members, including Marshall himself, traveled to Mexico, where they voluntarily underwent the procedure. It was kept completely secret within the group, and the outside world only learned of it later, when medical examiners discovered the evidence while processing the bodies after the events of March 1997. The castrations reveal something important about Marshall's leadership. This was not a man simply asking his followers to believe unusual things. This was a man asking them to permanently alter their bodies, and they did it, willingly. That is the measure of how completely he had taken over their inner worlds. Marshall led, as former members have described, with what felt like fatherly warmth. He could be gentle and attentive, particularly when someone was struggling. Followers genuinely adored him. They called him Doe, and when they spoke of him in the exit videos recorded in the group's final days, the love in their voices was unmistakable. But love and fear in the world Marshall created were not opposites, they were partners. The love was real, and so was the ever-present, unspoken understanding that disappointing Doe meant forfeiting your place on the spacecraft and potentially your soul along with it. By the mid-1980s, Heaven's Gate had reached a strange kind of equilibrium, strict, secretive, and utterly self-contained. And then everything changed, because the person Marshall needed most, the only person in the world who truly knew him, got sick.
Every belief system has a moment of crisis, a moment when the real world pushes back against the story being told, when events refuse to cooperate with the prophecy. What a leader does in that moment reveals everything. For Marshall Applewhite, that moment came on June 19, 1985. Bonnie Nettles, Tay, his other half, his co-founder, the person the theology had been built around, died of cancer. She was 57 years old. It's difficult to overstate what Bonnie's death meant to the group's belief system, because the theology had been constructed around both of them. They were the two, the pair of prophets from the book of Revelation. Everything, the mission, the legitimacy, the entire framework of their shared purpose was predicated on the idea that they would ascend together. They would be martyred together. They would be resurrected together. They would board the spacecraft together. But Bonnie didn't board a spacecraft. She died in a hospital bed from a disease that had slowly consumed her body over months, in exactly the way that ordinary human beings die. For any rational observer, this was the moment the whole structure should have collapsed. The prophecy had failed. The logic didn't hold. The two prophets of Revelation had become one, and the remaining one was a 60-year-old man whose most trusted companion was gone. Marshall was devastated. By all accounts, he genuinely loved Bonnie, not romantically, but deeply, in the way that only someone who has been truly known by another person can love them. She had seen him when he was at his lowest. She had told him he mattered. She had built this entire world alongside him, and now she was gone. He grieved. For a period, the group watched their leader struggle in ways he never had before.
But Marshall did not let the theology collapse. Instead, he did something that is, from a psychological standpoint, both remarkable and deeply revealing. He revised it. He told his followers that Bonnie had not failed to ascend, she had simply gone first. Her human body had worn out before the spacecraft arrived, so she had shed it early and returned to the next level ahead of them. She was already there, she was watching, she was still actively guiding the mission from beyond. How convenient, some former members later noted, but to those inside the group, people who had already surrendered years of their lives and all of their earthly connections to this belief, the explanation made a kind of devastating sense. Of course she went ahead. Of course she was already home. Doe had said so, and Doe was the only one who truly understood. What no one fully grasped at the time was how fundamentally this reinterpretation changed the theology's relationship with death. Before Bonnie died, the plan was physical ascension, bodies boarding a spacecraft, very much alive, departing Earth for the next level. After Bonnie died, a new idea took root. The human body was only a vessel, a temporary container, and if the vessel wore out, or if the time was right, shedding it might actually be the path to the next level rather than an obstacle to it. The seed of mass suicide had been planted. Nobody recognized it yet, but it was there. With Bonnie gone, Marshall reorganized both himself and the group's theology around his own singular authority. He stopped speaking of Tay as his equal partner and began positioning her as something more like a divine parent who had returned to the heavens. He began saying that Tay had been the Heavenly Father during their time on Earth together, and that he, Marshall, Doe, was the Son. And with that, he made a claim so bold that even some of his most devoted followers had to stop and absorb it. He was, he said, the current Christ. The second coming had already happened, and it was him. In a recorded statement, he said, "That mind that was in Jesus, that mind, that spirit, that soul is me." For most of the world, this statement would trigger immediate disbelief. But within the closed world of Heaven's Gate, where Marshall's voice was the only voice, where every outside perspective had been systematically cut off, where years of obedience had conditioned members to accept his interpretations without question, it landed differently. Most of them believed him. And why wouldn't they? They had seen his wisdom and his love up close for years. They had watched him navigate crisis after crisis with calm certainty. They had followed him through hardship after hardship and found meaning in the difficulty. If Doe said he was the Christ, then he was. If Doe said Tay had graduated to the next level ahead of them, then she had. The question of what it would mean for the rest of them to also graduate was still years away. But the answer was already taking shape.
Time moves differently inside a closed world. For most of the late 1980s and into the early 1990s, Heaven's Gate essentially disappeared from public view. No more large meetings, no more posters in small-town coffee shops, no more newspaper stories about a strange UFO cult recruiting people from Oregon motels. The group had pulled inward, and the world had largely moved on and forgotten about them. But Marshall hadn't forgotten about the world. He was watching it, and what he saw confirmed everything he already believed. By the late 1980s, the group had relocated to the San Diego area, eventually settling into a large rented mansion in Rancho Santa Fe, one of the wealthiest zip codes in California. On the surface, it looked like an upscale commune. Neighbors occasionally noticed the unusual number of residents, all dressed similarly, all keeping to themselves. But nothing ever crossed the threshold into genuinely alarming. To fund their existence, the group had made a shrewd, practical decision. They would build a technology business. Many Heaven's Gate members were educated, and some had backgrounds in computing. Under Marshall's guidance, they founded a small company called Higher Source, a name that, if you knew what to look for, told you everything, and began offering website design and programming services. This was the mid-1990s, the early days of the commercial internet, and businesses everywhere were scrambling to build an online presence and had no idea how to do it. Heaven's Gate did. They were good at it, They worked professionally, delivered quality results, and their clients, who had no idea who they were actually dealing with, were satisfied. Marshall viewed the internet not just as a business tool, but as a divine instrument. Technology was advancing, he taught his followers, because the next level was preparing humanity for its eventual evolution. And the internet specifically was a gift, a way to reach souls across the entire world without ever leaving the isolation and safety of the mansion. In 1996, they launched heavensgate.com. It is still online today. But before the website, Marshall had made one more attempt at large-scale recruitment. In 1992 and 1993, he produced a series of videos called Beyond Human: The Last Call, which aired on satellite television. The production was simple. Marshall sitting on a plain set, speaking directly to camera. No dramatic lighting, no music, no elaborate staging. He didn't need any of it. His delivery was calm and unhurried, but the urgency underneath every word was unmistakable. This was the last chance, he said. The Earth was approaching its final days. The recycling was coming. And anyone watching who felt that pull, that sense that there was something more, something beyond the ordinary life they were living, needed to act now, because there would not be another opportunity. A full-page advertisement also appeared in USA Today in 1993 under the headline, UFO Cult Resurfaces with Final Offer. Other ads ran in magazines and alternative newspapers across the country. The message was the same one Marshall had been delivering for 20 years, condensed into the bluntest possible language. Come with us or be destroyed. A handful of people responded. A few former members who had drifted away came back, but the massive wave of new recruitment Marshall had hoped for never materialized. By 1996, Heaven's Gate had settled into its final form, approximately 39 core members living together in Rancho Santa Fe, waiting. And then the comet came. In 1995, astronomers announced that a comet named Hale-Bopp had been discovered and was on a trajectory that would bring it spectacularly close to Earth in early 1997. It was expected to be one of the most visually stunning astronomical events in decades, visible to the naked eye, bright enough to see even from light-polluted cities. But what electrified Marshall, what sent an almost physical current of excitement through the entire group, was a rumor. A photograph taken by an amateur astronomer and widely circulated online appeared to show an unidentified object trailing just behind the comet. The image was fuzzy and ambiguous, and professional astronomers quickly dismissed it as a photographic artifact. But before the debunking could spread, the story had already gone viral in the early internet sense, passed from forum to forum, growing with each retelling. Was there a spacecraft following the comet? Marshall didn't hesitate for a single moment. Of course there was. He had been waiting for this. He had preached for 22 years that a sign would come from the next level, a signal that the time had arrived. And here it was, written across the night sky in fire and ice. Heaven's Gate updated their website in language that made it absolutely clear. Hale-Bopp's approach was the marker. The spacecraft was on its way. The classroom on Earth was coming to an end. Graduation was imminent.
In the weeks leading up to the comet's closest approach to Earth in March 1997, the mood inside the Rancho Santa Fe mansion shifted into something that survivors and investigators would later struggle to find the right words to describe. It wasn't grief. It wasn't fear. It wasn't the desperate, frantic energy of people who had been pushed to a breaking point. It was peace, or at least something that looked exactly like peace. The members of Heaven's Gate spent those final weeks in a state of focused, almost serene preparation. Marshall had given them what every human being ultimately wants, a story in which their lives had meaning, their suffering had purpose, and what was coming next was not an ending, but a beginning. They began recording their farewell videos. One by one, and sometimes in small groups, members sat in front of cameras and delivered what they called their exit statements. The videos are deeply unsettling to watch, not because of any obvious distress, but because of its absence. These were people who were clearly at ease. They smiled. They spoke warmly about dough and tea. They expressed genuine excitement about what was coming. They talked about how grateful they were for the life they had lived inside the group and how certain they were that they were making the right decision. "I don't think any of us could be more happy," one member said simply, and then laughed, a soft, genuine laugh. They weren't performing contentment. That's what made it so hard to watch. They genuinely felt it. The farewell videos served two purposes. They were personal goodbyes, final words for anyone who might later be trying to understand what had happened. But they were also, as the group explicitly stated, one last attempt to reach any soul that might be watching and still have time to join them. Marshall also prepared a press release, which the group titled "Away Team Returns to Level Above Human." It framed their departure not as a tragedy or a loss, but as a triumphant homecoming, a team that had completed its assignment on a distant planet and was now returning to base. He was still, right up to the very last moment, a storyteller. On the evening of March 21st, the group went out for dinner together. They chose their favorite local restaurant, Marie Callender's, where they had spent many evenings over the years. They filed in wearing their identical dark clothing, sat together, and ordered their last meal. Every single person at the table ordered the exact same thing: turkey pot pie, iced tea, and cheesecake with blueberries for dessert. The deliberateness of it, the complete unity right down to the dessert, was both touching and devastating. This was a group of people who had surrendered their individuality so completely that even their final meal on Earth was communal. There was no one reaching for something different, no one saying they preferred something else. They moved as one, the way they had learned to move over the course of years of disciplined living. After dinner, they went home. Beginning on March 22nd, the graduation, as they called it, commenced in stages. A note found in the house afterward laid out the plan clearly. 15 members first, assisted by 8 helpers, then 15 more, assisted by 8 more helpers, then finally the last group helping each other. The staggering was practical. The earlier deaths needed to be attended to before the later ones could proceed. Each member had a prepared resting place, a bunk or bed with a purple shroud laid nearby to be placed over the body once they had passed. A small travel bag sat beside each of them, containing identification and a small amount of money. Some sources have noted the bags and suggested they were packed for the journey ahead, a detail that is either heartbreaking or haunting depending on how you sit with it. The method involved a lethal combination of sedatives mixed into pudding or applesauce to make them easier to consume, along with alcohol in some cases. Once a member had ingested the mixture and lost consciousness, a plastic bag was placed over their head as a failsafe. Notes recovered from the house confirmed that this was deliberate. The instructions literally read, "Use plastic bag to be sure." Toxicology reports later showed that some members had not received a fully fatal dose of sedative, suggesting that the bags had in some cases been the primary cause of death, or that one of the remaining members had helped ensure the completion of each stage before their own turn came. Once a person had died, the helpers removed the bag, smoothed the purple shroud over the body, and prepared for the next stage. Over the course of several days, 39 people passed from this world. Marshall Applewhite was among the last 4 to die. He was found in the master bedroom, dressed identically to the others, eyes closed, positioned with the same peaceful composure that had defined every moment of his final weeks. His heart disease, the coroner noted, likely caused the sedatives to work more quickly on him than on others. He died as he had lived since the day he met Bonnie in that hospital room, certain he was going somewhere better.
The call came in to the San Diego County Sheriff's Department on March 26, 1997. The caller was a man named Rio D'Angelo, also known as Richard Ford, a former member of Heaven's Gate who had not been living with the group in their final months. He had received a package in the mail containing videotapes and a letter, and when he went to the mansion to investigate, he found what was waiting for him inside. He called 911. When deputies arrived at the Rancho Santa Fe mansion, they moved through it room by room in the kind of silence that only descends on places where something irreversible has occurred. In room after room, they found people lying on bunks and beds, covered in purple fabric, hands at their sides, eyes closed, faces calm. 39 human beings who appeared in the most surreal way to simply be asleep. They were all wearing identical black shirts and black sweatpants. They all had matching Nike sneakers on their feet, black and white, new-looking, neatly laced. Small travel bags sat beside each of them. A hive of law enforcement descended on the property. The media followed immediately after, and images from the scene began circulating within hours. The purple-draped figures, the carefully arranged bodies, the Nike shoes clearly visible in photographs taken through windows and doorways. The images were strange in a way that was difficult to look away from. There was no chaos, no evidence of struggle, no sense of violence in the conventional sense, just order. Disturbing, deliberate, total order. The autopsies confirmed what the scene had suggested. Deaths were caused by combinations of sedative poisoning and asphyxiation. The medical examiner's findings also confirmed something the group had kept private for years. Several of the male members, including Marshall himself, had undergone surgical castration. The world reacted with a mixture of horror, disbelief, and a kind of morbid fascination that the media was not entirely sure how to handle. Saturday Night Live ran a sketch about the Nike shoes. Talk shows debated the nature of cults and brainwashing. Experts on religious psychology and sociology gave interviews trying to explain what had happened and why. The heavensgate.com website, still live and still maintained by a small number of surviving members and former associates who have chosen to keep it online, became one of the most visited sites on the early internet in the days and weeks that followed. It is still there. You can visit it today. Marshall's words, their theology, the farewell videos, all of it preserved exactly as they left it. The questions people asked in 1997 are the same questions that still don't have clean answers. How does this happen? How do intelligent, educated, otherwise functional people end up in a place where they willingly end their lives based on the word of a man who believed a spaceship was hiding behind a comet? The uncomfortable truth, and this is the part that actually matters, is that there is no simple answer, and the absence of a simple answer is precisely the point. Heaven's Gate did not recruit broken people. Former member Joan Culpepper, who left the group and became one of its most vocal critics, made this point explicitly. Many of these people weren't losers with low self-esteem. Applewhite's message connected to some belief in them. What the members of Heaven's Gate shared was not stupidity or mental illness. What they shared was a longing, a genuine, deeply human longing for something that felt true, for community, for purpose, for the sense that there was something beyond the ordinary grind of daily life that was worth giving yourself to completely. Marshall Applewhite spent his entire life searching for exactly that, and when he couldn't find it in the stages of Broadway or in the halls of academia or in the relationships he kept building and destroying, he built it himself, a cosmos of his own design, one in which all of his failures had been preparation and all of his suffering had been meaning. The tragedy is that he brought 38 other people with him into that cosmos, people who were not broken, people who were, in many ways, just doing what humans have always done, looking for something worth believing in. Marshall's life, from the preacher's son in Spur, Texas, to the self-proclaimed Christ who died in a mansion believing a spaceship was coming for him, is one of the most genuinely haunting stories of the 20th century. Not because of its strangeness, but because of how utterly recognizable the pieces are. The need for belonging, the sting of repeated failure, the hunger for purpose, the charisma that bends toward control when it cannot find a legitimate stage. Heaven's Gate ended in March 1997, but the website is still up. The videos are still there, and the questions Marshall Applewhite spent his entire life trying to answer, questions about meaning and purpose and what comes after, are the same questions every one of us is still living with. The spaceship never came, but the people who were waiting for it were real, and they deserve to be remembered as exactly that, people.